good. Thank you very much, Megan, and welcome everybody to data migration, moving your data to a better place.
Data.
Okay, so what are we going to do today? The real purpose of this webinar is to be able to describe how you can define the types of data that need to be migrated, the final resting places of those data. It is not always instantly apparent which data and what data and where it should be migrated to. So in order to do that, we're going to go through some definitions. We're going to describe different types of data migration. We're going to describe the different types of legacy data that are out there, and recognizing that different data may be justified to be migrated into different target systems. There are many options available to data migration, and one of the most important things you can do during any data migration project is to identify those options and to be able to build a business case around selecting one of those options, which is the most suitable for your particular organization. Once we've gone through that, we're going to go through and just wrap up with data migration steps and the overall data migration planning process, and then we will get into some questions and answers. So, moving forward, let's go through some definitions here. For those of you that are familiar with databases, just bear with me for about 30 seconds because all of this will be very well known to you. So, some definitions. An entity. Within a database, it's a single thing about which data can be stored. And to use an example which will be applicable to the lab, let's use an example of a sample. So assuming that a sample is an entity within your database, it will have relationships with other entities in the database. Other entities may be such things as tests and results. And there is such a thing as an entity relationship diagram that describes the relationships between entities within your database. Something else which is important, which is the field. And within an entity, the lowest common denominator of information in there is the field. So that's a single piece of data that describes the entity in which it is encapsulated. We're now going to move to the other level of abstraction, and that is the database schema. And the database schema is a description of the entire database, and it defines all the entities, all the attributes of those entities, and the relationships between those entities. Data typically is stored within tables, which is really just a data structure that organizes the information into rows and columns, such that you can think of it perhaps going back to our sample description of each row is a sample and each column is an attribute about that sample, which may include tests to be performed on that sample. Another couple of very important concepts when you're considering data migration are stored procedures and triggers. Stored procedure is really some SQL statements that is stored within the database, which performs a specific function when activated. A trigger is a special form of a stored procedure that automatically fires off when an action is made on the database. So, for example, it could be within your sample entity, whenever the status of that sample is changed, a trigger could be fired off, which could manipulate or modify or transform data in other areas of the database. Stored procedures and triggers are of particular importance when you're talking about migrating data from one system to another. You need to know from the source system whether there are any stored procedures and triggers. Now, a couple of very simple definitions. Source system, also known as the legacy system, is the system that is the source of the data that we want to migrate. is the target system. Pretty straightforward definitions, those. And now we're going to get into the real meat of this webinar, the data migration definitions. So we define data migration as the process of moving or copying data between storage types, formats, or computer systems. So when you think about it, data migration could include backing up your data to a tape environment. You are moving your data from one storage medium to another. Data conversion is really the process of converting or transforming data from one format to another as part of the overall data migration process. So typically, if you are migrating data from one Lab Informatics system to another, there is normally significant data transformation that needs to go on, especially if you're moving from one vendor to another. And then final definition is data loading, and that is the process of loading the data into the target system. It's important to note that during the loading, prior to performing data loading, the transformation process has been completed. So data loading is merely moving data from typically a staging database into the target system, and without any modification to the structure or the database schema of the target system.